My name is Bhagwan Chowdhry. I'm a professor of finance at ISB. Um, Today, this series is a joint series for this special session. This is the Global ISB Forum, in which I meet a thought leader once a month to discuss things that are of general interest. But what's special today is that this is also part of Earth Heart 2020, which is an annual finance conclave run by ISB students. It is my great honor and great privilege to welcome to this Shilpa Kumar. Um, Shilpa currently is a partner at Omidyar. So rather than give a long introduction, I am going to ask Shilpa a bunch of questions, and in that process, it will become clear where she is right now and how she got there. So, Shilpa, first of all, partnered at Omidyar. What does that mean? What does Omidyar
Right.
do? Oh,
Okay. Let's start with that. And pleasure to be here, Bhagwan. So, Omidyar Network is the philanthropy of uh, Pierre and Pam Omidyar. Pierre was the founder of eBay, and he actually has set up a social impact investment fund. Omidyar Network India is the Indian leg of his work. And when we say social impact, I think, Bhagwan, it's quite interesting that while the objective is social impact, the tools we use are a very creative and diverse set of tools. So we look for entrepreneurs who want to make impact in our world, and to do it through for-profit enterprises. We look at funding entrepreneurs who want to create a social impact and want to do it through an NGO. And sometimes, we feel the right way to look at a problem is even to just throw more light on it. And therefore, we also fund research. So as a social impact investment fund, we have what we call is a dual checkbook. And we use it across all of these various instruments. The last thing I will add is in India, Omidyar Network India, we have a mission statement, which is really that we support bold entrepreneurs who want to make life meaningful for every Indian. So that's what it really means to be a partner at Omidyar.
okay. Bold entrepreneurs who want to make life better for every Indian. So
That's right.
this is a social impact. And we know that over the last decade or so, especially this field of impact investing has started to buzz. In
Mhm.
fact, uh, BlackRock's CEO said that this is going to be a big part of their strategy going forward, and they manage literally trillions of dollars. So I think this
Right.
is going to see a lot of action. But so let me understand. So you're saying Omidyar would do, especially the what you are heading, something that has an impact. Some of it may be pure impact, like
Mhm.
research.
Right.
Others would be impact, but it also has to be profitable. So
Mm.
it's an entrepreneurial activity. So
Right.
there are different shades of impact that you support. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. So we've invested close to $300 million in the country so far. We invest about 50 million annually, and we do this over six or seven sectors in which we have deep interest. So, for example, financial inclusion, education, digital identity and digital society, property rights. These are all illustrations of sectors in which we have deep interest. And the theory of change that we work with is sometimes you need more information for problem solvers to come in and solve the problem. And therefore, we will support bold research entrepreneurs. But sometimes you may have actually, let's say, infrastructure which an entrepreneur can leverage and profitably develop a solution and deliver it in a more accessible, affordable way.
I
And if
see.
you see some of our investments in fintech, or ed tech, they're really testing that hypothesis. So, it's a variety of ways in which, we try to drive social impact.
Yeah. And in fact, you and I have been talking a lot in the last several months because um, Omidyar has funded an initiative called Digital Identity Research Initiative for the
Right.
last 2.5 years. And I am heading that. And I came about a year ago, and that's about the time when Shilpa came to Omidyar as a partner. So Shilpa is also heading what's called financial inclusion. And today's talk, we are going to spend a lot of time on those issues of financial inclusion. But her agenda at Omidyar is much broader than financial inclusion. It's also about citizenship rights. It's also about social issues and justice issues as well. So thank you very much. Now I want to sort of start going back in your life. I'm kind of going in your like your LinkedIn profile, but going backwards.
Right.
Until a year or so ago, you were the MD and CEO of ICICI Securities.
That's right.
Um, and you were at ICICI for over 2 decades. I remember meeting you 15 years ago when I was visiting here with my dean from UCLA,
Right.
and we were talking about financial engineering programs.
Right.
And I met you in your office, and you said, "Oh, I just finished my financial engineering degree at the UC Berkeley not too long ago."
Right.
Um, Let me say, this is unusual. I'll tell you why this is unusual.
Mhm.
If I were to think about how many women are in finance in India who have a leadership position,
Mhm.
I don't think I can fill one hand.
Mhm.
Now, you before that went to IIM Calcutta. Am I allowed to say the other institute? Okay. Before ISB came into existence, um, you got your MBA at IIM Cal. Choosing to go into finance at that time must have
Mhm.
been even more unusual. Now, ISB boasts close to 40% of our PGP class is women, which I
Mhm.
think is very encouraging, 39%. In your class,
Mhm.
what percent of the class at IIM Calcutta were women, and how many of were doing finance? Do you
Yeah.
remember?
Interesting you ask, Bhagwan. So we were under 10%. We were a definite minority. And we were also a double minority, I would say, because most of the class was engineers.
Yeah.
And a predominant part of them, I would say, had come from IITs. So,
And how about you? You didn't go to IIT.
no, I was, a Bachelor of Commerce from Sydenham College, Mumbai.
Yeah.
And so finance in that sense was a much easier natural extension. But I will say this, that even when it came to placement, really, like finance jobs were very defined, and I had never heard of ICICI before, till placement time. And it's hard to think about that now because
Yeah.
ICICI is such a household name. And I still recall that when I joined them, and folks at home used to ask me, okay, and where are you working? They used to often confuse it with ICI, the paint company. Uh,
Oh,
yeah, because ICI was a bigger brand name than ICICI at that point. So, much has changed, Bhagwan, and, much has changed.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I am delighted that you are in that position, and I hope many women in our program are inspired by your leadership. And I was looking at your profile here, and I'm not going to read it. But maybe I'll read it very quickly. So you're MDC at ICICI. You have had board positions at many organizations, including. Uh, Many positions in ICICI, but also Clearing Corporation of India, the National Investment Infrastructure Fund, but also regulatory bodies like SEBI's Secondary Market Advisory Committee, RBI's Technical Advisory Committee, Monetary Committee on Monetary Policy, FIMMDA, which I don't even know what that is, FICCI Capital Markets, and on and on. So, um, I want to ask you this question sort of at a personal level. When you
Mhm.
go to those board meetings,
Mhm.
chances are you are probably the only woman, or
Mhm.
maybe one of the two women in those boardrooms.
Mhm.
Tell us a little bit about how it is, what it is like, and is it changing in India? Are we seeing more women now at these board positions?
Right. So, early on, Bhagwan, you said that you could count on your fingers the number of women in senior positions in BFSI. And I could say, all five of those fingers could probably be ICICI women.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, because actually we did have a fair degree of women in leadership positions. I think it was a combination, of the early leadership of Mr. Vaghul and then Mr. Kamath
Yeah.
that must have resulted in that happening. But we had a bunch of very capable, people in leadership positions, both men and women, and a number of them actually went on to head other institutions in India, whether it be banks or mutual funds or insurance companies. So I would say ICICI itself was a big contributor of this pool. But flipping to the other question you asked, I think somehow as I, kind of progressed within ICICI and moved into both leadership roles within and outside, I think I actually very rarely felt gender was even an issue I thought about for myself. I mean,
Mhm.
uh, you know, in a sense that, one always approached it with your uh, in a sense, own knowledge of the subject. You brought into it your own perspectives. And I felt as long as those were strong and valid, and, I don't think I got treated any differently, really, Bhagwan. Of course, there will be the odd experience, but I would say, broadly, I actually had a good experience in all the boards I was on.
That's really encouraging to know. How about these regulatory boards, these government type of boards?
Right.
That their women leadership must be rarity. Is that right?
But so it's interesting you asked this, Bhagwan. So first of all, I must tell you, you said you don't know what FIMDA stands for. FIMDA is actually the Fixed Income and Money
Okay.
Market Dealers Association.
Okay. This
And
is a country of acronyms, so I'm still getting used to it.
yeah, yeah, sure, you're forgiven. You're forgiven. So because I used to head treasury in ICICI,
Yeah.
I was on the board of FIMDA for many years, and I actually was the chair of FIMDA also for a couple of
Oh,
years.
okay.
And it's very interesting how structured Indian regulators are. So I have two comments actually. One is I would say my time at FIMTA was one of the most fascinating times in terms of both learning as well as informing the discussions that I participated in, because the Reserve Bank's approach is, any new change they want to come out with, they will get the industry associations involved. And therefore, I used to be part of RBI's technical advisory committee also, from that perspective. And the other strange thing I must tell you, not strange thing, but good thing, is that on the other side at that time, so you have the RBI governor and you have four deputy governors. So two of those four deputy governors were women,
Mm-hmm.
and very admirable, strong women, Mrs.
Mm-hmm.
Thorat and Mrs. Gopinath.
Yeah.
And I must say, I used to find those meetings very interesting. And I would also find that the governor himself, in the policy consultations, would spend a lot of time listening to market feedback. And there was a great degree of thoughtfulness about those meetings.
Mm.
So I must say I enjoyed being a part of that as well.
Okay. So uh, I'm so glad that you gave us this perspective because we know a lot about you based on what is written, but some of these personal things we only get to know when we speak with you. Okay. So let's talk about financial inclusion.
Mhm.
Now, your previous role at ICICI didn't have much to do with financial inclusion, or did it?
So I would say, short answer is no. Short answer is no. But even like the roles that I had first at ICICI in terms of global markets and the second one at ICICI Securities, it was always about expanding the number of people whom you could engage and do business with.
Okay.
So in ICICI, for example, when I set up the treasury, early on around 2000, it was largely a wholesale business, and the revenue was under 50 crores. But by the time I left, almost 15 years later, we had not just a wholesale treasury business, we had something for the MSME, we had something for the retail customer. And in each case, the focus was how do you make it better, more accessible in terms of customer.
Yeah.
And the same thing repeated in ICICI Securities, because I must tell you that ICICI Securities actually runs ICICI Direct, which is one of the biggest retail brokerages and a very efficient online brokerage. And
Mhm.
again, the effort over there was how can you educate customers about better investing, how can you get more inclusion
Yeah.
done. But I will agree with you on this that the focus was largely on what we would say is the first half billion. So the 500 million people who are already more educated, who already have income say 20,000 plus, and in a sense already people who are able to help themselves move up the curve in terms of both living livelihoods, etc. At Omidyar, our focus is on what we call the next half billion.
That's
So this
right.
is,
So,
yeah,
so that's what I meant. That's a switch for you.
a
And
switch. It's
this
a
is something that must be brewing in your head for a
right.
decade or so before you decide. So tell us how that happened. I mean, when Umedia reached out to you and said they wanted you to lead financial inclusion, what were you thinking?
Right. So I must, two comments. One is, I think, through my kind of roles at both ISEC and markets, global markets, I think the importance of policy in actually making inclusion happen, I think that was very apparent to me.
Hmm.
Regulation, data, policy, etc. And it was something which I did feel somewhat passionate about.
Yeah.
uh, when I came to Omidyar, and I must just clarify, Bhagwan, that I lead financial policy at
Yeah.
Omidyar.
Yes.
Yeah. So the whole focus that Omidyar has on improving the lives, especially of the next half billion. So the 500 million people plus who are actually earning, let's say, less than 20,000 a month,
Yeah.
but who are the people who, if empowered, can really make a big leap in terms of living and livelihoods for themselves and their families.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting how critical a role financial inclusion has to play in making this shift for this community of people. So I find it quite fascinating.
Okay, so we'll talk about some of the work we are doing together, but also what Omidyar is doing in general. Let me pause here and see, Sulagna, are there any questions that are relevant for what we have discussed so far? If there are, we can take those.
Yeah, actually, there is one question about financial inclusion. So, should I go ahead?
So let's wait for that one because we are just starting
Okay,
to
sure,
get this conversation.
sure.
Okay, so uh, Shilpa, as you know, that I have been interested in financial inclusion for about 2 decades or so as well. And about 7 or 8 years ago, I came and I was excited to see, digital identity was here. Aadhaar was growing by leaps and bounds.
Right.
Uh, People were talking about bank account for everybody. So I wrote this blog called "Financial Inclusion is Imminent in India,"
Mm-hmm.
uh, but I think I was too optimistic. It wasn't imminent. That was 6, 7 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and I moved to India sort of full time last year. And although we see much progress in financial inclusion at the street level, people are still afraid of technology. Most people do not like to use digital means, they prefer cash. It's imminent was not the right word to use.
Mm-hmm.
We still have long ways to go.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? What is holding us back, you think?
Yeah. So, Bhagwan, I feel you were not wrong when you said that, so many years ago. And I do feel, depending on your perspective, actually the glass might be much more full than you think.
Okay.
And I'll explain to you why. So let's first of all take even if we take the first half billion, I would say life has really changed for people on that front. So I think digitization, access to credit, so much has improved for the
That I
first half.
agree with. That I agree with. I think people who are included are now really included. So that I get. So
Okay,
I can book things on my Uber, I can make these transactions, I can transfer. But I was already included. Previously, I had to go to a bank branch. I don't have to go to a bank branch anymore. So
sure,
yes, my life has improved with GPay and so on and so forth.
correct. Yeah.
But
So
I'm talking about the maid who made dosa for me today. She
right.
doesn't want to take her salary digitally. She wants it in cash.
Sure. No, I cannot disagree with that at all. So let's address that. And I think the journey for financial inclusion, there's still a long road to go.
Okay.
Having said that, let's count what's good about
Yeah.
what has happened so far. I think we do this survey, and of course you know this well, Bhagwan. We call it State of Aadhaar report, and in that I think it's one of the biggest reports about Aadhaar. We cover almost 150,000 people, and the one thing that came out very strongly is that Aadhaar gave a lot of people a trusted identity.
Okay.
And more than 95%, I think, of adults have identity, which is Aadhaar. So I think that's a really important change that has
It's
happened.
a big deal. I don't know if people get it or not. I think it's a big, big deal.
It is. It is.
Because
It
in
is.
2011, when I spoke to Nandan, I think I spoke to a reporter from Reuters. He
Mhm.
said, "There is no way this is going anywhere." Those were his words. There is no
Right.
way this is going anywhere. India, billion people, billion identities. Yeah, sure. Those were his words. And
Yeah.
now to be able to say that, 1.24 billion
Yeah.
Aadhaar numbers have been issued, it is a big deal. Okay,
Yeah,
that's
and it's the other reason it's a big deal is because it's trusted. That's the other thing that came out from the report, that I have an identity and I trust this identity. And in fact, the third interesting thing was I actually fear that too much of my life is,
yeah.
in a sense, and therefore it needs to be that much more solid because so much is linked to it. So that's the, third takeaway we had. Another very interesting insight, Bhagwan, is that a lot of people for the first time could access financial services because of this identity, Aadhaar. So
Give
the
us an example. What was it that people could not before this, and now they are
yeah,
able to? Mhm.
so if you want to open a bank account, right? I mean, the banker will say, okay, naam kya hai, pata kya hai,
Yeah.
and so what's your name, what's your address? And if you don't have something to prove who you are, so KYC failure could be a big reason for getting turned down. So I'm saying, the first and important thing is Aadhaar gave identity, a trusted identity. I think the second thing which this government did is, when Prime Minister Modi came, he really pushed the second pillar of the Trinity very hard. So the whole Jandan
Uh-huh.
account
Mhm.
mobilization was a big deal also. So that was the second. And I think the third thing that has happened obviously is the mobile revolution, and people kind of
Yeah.
going digital. So with this trinity, I think the rails have been laid for very important activity, which is that if nothing else, can your safety net in the form of government benefits reach you?
Yes.
uh, and at least to that, which is captured by our State of Aadhaar survey, at least to that, Bhagwan, we can say, and it got tested during COVID.
During COVID, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. This was the time we were thankful that we put this infrastructure in place.
that's true. And the survey actually showed we surveyed 50,000 people post during COVID, and almost 85% of them had got one transfer or another from the government through the Jan Dhan account. And therefore, I think, yeah, the last mile journey, there's still a long road to go.
Mhm.
But at the first point, I think we have to admit that a lot has been achieved. And in a time of crisis, when 50%, lost their jobs, another 20% found, wages had decreased, you still could reach out with a safety net digitally and with no loss on the way. I think it's a big deal.
So in your survey of
Right.
50,000 people, did you find that there were people who did not even know that money had been transferred to their account? For example, when Nirmala Sitharaman said, I'm going to give 500 rupees to women, I asked my aide, did you get it? She said, what are you talking about? She didn't know. And
Yeah.
did you find that issue?
Sure. So now let's move to, therefore that the glass half empty part of it. And I agree with you that there is still a long way to go in terms of, information and
Information.
accessibility of these accounts. And why I say both is equally important. One is, do you know that you're entitled to?
Yeah,
That's one. Second is, did you get it? That's
yeah,
another.
yeah.
And third is, having got it, did you take it? Could you take it out of the bank? That's the
Mhm,
third, and
mhm.
all three are important. I mean, and we've debated this often, Bhagwan, but maybe for the broader group on this
Yeah,
call, I'd love to add, that what I always feel strongly about is that the person who needs this the most has the least ability to get their hands on it for various reasons, and
uh,
particularly not least about, because if you're in a small village and you don't have a point where you can access your bank account, going and getting that money out of the bank account really means a day's wage for you.
it's an ordeal. Yeah.
you know and therefore I think that last mile financial inclusion is the most important, because it is for people who are not just sometimes excluded, but for whom it is very expensive to access the formal financial channel.
Yes.
uh, so let me pause here and see what you think.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So as you mentioned that sometimes this gets lost because when we look at aggregate numbers like GDP and things like that,
Right.
you kind of take an average across all. So this may seem like a small part to the GDP contribution, but your point is
Right.
this is where it matters the
Correct.
most.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we should not say, oh, its only contribution is 0.5% to GDP. This
Right.
is where it matters more. So we have seen, as you and I have started to work on it, that there are a number of initiatives people are taking. So uh, I want to sort of say, what is it that the private sector is doing now with fintech that
Mhm.
is making some of these things happen now? Could you give us a
Right.
little, yeah,
Yeah. So, I think that's the fascinating thing about our country, Bhagwan, that, when you had these, rails, the infrastructure in terms of, let's say, NPCI and Jandhan
yeah,
Aadhaar Mobile, the entrepreneurial spirit in the country, just took over. And the fascinating number of market solutions that have come about is just amazing. And they can be at different, different kinds of things. So, maybe I can talk about a few of the entrepreneurs we have
sure, yeah.
back. So, for example, you have KaleidoFin,
Hmm.
which actually is all about how do you encourage next half billion to digitally maybe increase the diversity and the quantum of savings. So that's one illustration. The other is, how do you make credit available? And let me tell you about a very fascinating company we've invested in along with Seva, the Seva group, which is
Yeah,
Seva Krerin. This is really to do with enabling credit against informal titles,
yeah. Hmm.
and with a particular focus on women borrowers.
So the titles meaning like land titles
Yeah,
and
so let me give you an illustration, Bhagwan. For example, if you go to, let's say an informal settlement in a city, because it's an informal settlement, nobody is going to have a full title,
yeah,
of
yeah.
their land. But people live there, people have houses, people have been living there for ages. And how do you, against the informal title that you have, how can you borrow to improve the quality of your home? And
Mm.
in Orissa, we actually worked with the government of Orissa on informal titling. uh, the results are fantastic. I mean, people who had titles actually made their houses better. And then when there are cyclones and rain, etc., you find that these houses hold up much more. So it's just fascinating what the outcomes can be if the right kind of capital is invested in a certain business model.
Yeah. So I think the point you're making is actually a fairly important one. Let me make sure I understand it.
Hmm.
So one is what you're saying is for credit, there needs to be some sort of collateral, but it doesn't need to be a physical collateral. It doesn't need to be a house or a motorcycle. Even an informal collateral, as long as we know about it, can make you credit worthy. And this is also related to your point about savings. There's a link between savings and credit
Right.
because it's not so much that if you save, you're going to earn interest on that. The fact that there is a record of your savings
Yeah.
is like an intangible collateral that
Right.
makes credit available to you for either business or for emergencies. And we have not appreciated that part, that that's the reason we need to bring everybody into the fold so that we understand who they are and what their capacity is.
Sure. No, I agree with you, So on the one hand, when we talk about financial inclusion and trust is for a person to put their savings into, let's say, the bank.
Yeah.
But equally, when it comes to lending, it's about the lender, having faith and trust in the person to whom the loan is being made.
Yeah.
And I think what digital identity does is it brings transparency, it brings information, and it's really important to see how that can be used. Having said that, Bhagwan, the other passion we have over here is how do you use all of this in a responsible way? uh,
Yeah, I was going to get to that. That's a tricky issue. So, as
right,
soon as you say information, people worry about privacy, they worry about invasion into your this thing.
right.
But I want to ask you a question. The second half billion you're talking about,
Hmm.
is privacy on top of their mind, or is livelihood on top of this? Should we put too much emphasis on privacy that you and I worry about because we are in the
Right.
first half billion? Should we have the same emphasis? What do you think? It's not an easy
Yeah.
question. It's not
It,
an
it's not, but I think it would be important to have certain basic standards,
okay.
because in the end, if you look at it, even the Constitution, in a sense, grants that to every single person a right to a certain degree of privacy. And I think it's important to have that balance in the design of things, and at the same time, not to, take it to such a level that uh, the ability to include goes away because of this, focus on one thing or the other. And actually, that's been my philosophy always, Bhagwan, that it's all about the right balance. I think if you want to do it in a way that balances various things, I think you can always find a solution that works for everyone. And I'm actually quite comforted by the fact that even when we look at some of the entrepreneurs we fund on the civil society side, for example, it might be someone who's trying to get safety nets in place for migrant workers.
Mm-hmm.
I find these entrepreneurs are quite willing to do this in a privacy by design way. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm quite encouraged by that.
Okay, I like that phrase. I like that phrase, privacy by design. I think so. You're
Mhm.
saying think about it while you're designing the product and not as an after fact. After,
Sure,
yeah, yeah.
that's right.
And just to let the audience know that that's one of the things we are doing at Digital Identity Research is to bring such a platform in which information can be culled, but it will be anonymized before it could be used because when you anonymize and aggregate it, it creates data that is useful and we think of it as a public good. and at
Mhm.
the same time we don't violate your personal privacy. So there is a lot of work that is going on in this, and with the help of Omidyar grant and another grant from Gates Foundation, we are making progress on building that platform. um, Tell us a little bit more about let me stop here and see, Sulagna, if we should take any questions at this time.
Yes, Professor, there are a couple of
Okay.
questions. Uh,
Please read out to us. And if you have the names of people, please read out their names as well.
okay, the first one is from Adarsh. So it is before creating financial inclusion products, shouldn't we first develop solutions that create financial awareness and educated people who do not even own bank accounts about the importance of savings?
Okay. So this thing always comes up about financial
Yeah.
literacy. And okay. So his question is, should financial literacy precede financial inclusion? I have a view, but I'm curious to hear your view.
Yeah. No, so it's, many moving parts, first of all. And I think, financial literacy itself can be, spoken about in many different ways. And let me give you an illustration. So when it comes to even safety nets and direct benefit transfers, the point you made, Bhagwan, that the lady who works with you or made your dosa today had no knowledge about it. The fact is there needs to be a lot of dissemination
Mhm.
and awareness building,
Mhm.
for financial inclusion to work. So I agree with that. But we don't need to go, in a sense, the whole hog before getting things started. And again, let me illustrate. During COVID, for example, when we launched something called a rapid response initiative. And one of the biggest grants we made small grants to a lot of civil society organizations. Some of the largest grants we made were actually to dissemination providers, people who would
Yeah.
provide literacy and do it in very different ways, local language. So
Yeah.
we actually funded radio stations like Gramvani. We funded grassroots organizations who could talk to their communities in local language. So I think literacy building has to be something that goes on the side. But at the same time, if you take direct benefit transfers, increasing reach, increasing awareness, increasing availability itself can give a big a boost to this awareness and literacy creation. So I think it's almost like a
Yeah.
parallel processing. Love to hear your views, Bhagwan.
Yeah, no, no, I agree. So I think I agree with you that I think this idea that learning has to happen in a classroom or in a school is a mistake. We have
Right.
known for centuries in India, especially, that learning happens as you do things. And I think the same is true for financial literacy. As people will start to use it, they will learn from each other. So if one maid learns it, she will tell her friend, who will tell her
Right.
friend. And
Right.
that's how this is going to proceed. So we can't just wait for one to finish and then start. I think this almost happens simultaneously. And the great example of this is mobile phones. Remember,
Mm-hmm.
when first mobile phones came, people said, oh, this is a technology product. The poor are not going to be able to use it. Now
True.
we know that poor are using it more effectively in some
Up.
sense
Yeah.
than the rest of us are. So I think similar thing could be said about digital literacy. And the other point that you mentioned, I want to emphasize it again. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
important. It is that when there is more of it, then the visibility also goes up. When there are only a few people using it, nobody knows. But when a lot of people know, then you will hear that yes, the finance minister did say it. So you said about radio, and this it's very, very important. And
True.
I think we are learning now
Mm-hmm.
that voice is much more important than text,
True.
because
True.
it goes away language barriers. You can speak in the language, and for many such things we need to bring voice back. And interestingly, this happened at the same time as Siri came and Alexa came, because now we are realizing that people are much more comfortable with voice. It builds that trust. So, going to the trust issue,
Mhm.
that's crucial in making people feel
True,
comfortable.
true.
And you have talked about, you have used this word in the past called phygital. We
Mhm.
need physical and digital. So a human interface,
Mhm.
voice is just one part, but being able to do it with another person seems like something we could encourage. So tell us more
Right,
about where we are heading in that direction.
right. Yeah, so this is, I guess relates to the conversation we've had about the absolute last mile.
Yeah.
And the absolute last mile in any, I think, in any field is always the trickiest, because in a sense the hurdles could be the highest, so the most excluded. And the fact, like you said, Bhagwan, that at a time like this, the people who are most excluded are probably the most needy, but they lack maybe the education, the access to get any of these benefits of financial inclusion. And therefore, what becomes important, because you have two things happening: the formal financial access point is not available close to them. So how do you make that access point go as close to them as possible?
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
secondly, how do you close that access in terms of maybe language and trust, for the individual at the other end? And I think there the role of the last mile intermediaries becomes just tremendously important. And
Unpack,
I think,
unpack that a little bit. Last mile intermediary. That sounds
right.
like an MBA class, but unpack that
Yeah.
a little bit.
Yeah, so let's take an illustration. I mean, you might have, in this case, let me take a remittance that a worker who's working in Mumbai wants to send to his family in Orissa. It could happen that the wife is, tending the farm, has to look after the children, stays on her farm plot far away from the nearest bank point. So today we have entrepreneurs who make it easy for this worker to send the money to the nearest bank. The question becomes that from that bank branch, which could be many miles away, could be a day's travel away, how do you make that money reach the
Yeah.
lady on her farm? And I think entrepreneurs in India, fintech entrepreneurs in India have, sorry about that, have actually been able to come up with a BC, business correspondent,
Yeah. Hmm.
model, which sits on top of the financial infrastructure that, say, NPCI has.
Yeah.
And they can enable that the grocer in this lady's village
Yeah.
can actually give her the money that her husband has sent.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it's a combination, therefore, of the formal financial channel and the last mile point,
Yeah.
quite literally unpacking, the money for the lady at the other end. So I think that's, something which I'd love to see it really, blossom many times more, because there's still a lot of last mile people whom we need to connect up.
Right. So Kirana store people, chai walas, and
Correct.
people like that, postmen. I mean, the people I trust and see everywhere, they can help me do the last part of the transaction.
That's right. Yeah.
And what what was missing until a decade or so ago was, how do I trust this person? But now at the back end, we have technology that can make sure that happens.
Correct.
So if I'm a BC and I'm helping you, that transaction will be tagged and there will be a record of this, so it will be hard to. And we know that the informal thing works very well, from even things that have been controversial like Sahara. People say, okay,
Hmm.
look at this, but the success of Sahara was really that
Hmm.
they used people you trusted. uh,
Hmm.
but now if you can take a Sahara model and make the back end so that make sure that it is really secure, the government is behind it, then I think we can. So you're
Correct.
saying formal and informal together might
Yeah.
might work. So I am also encouraged, like you are, uh,
Hmm.
with this. let me see if there are other questions. And if not, I have a few more. Sulagna.
Yeah, Professor. So we have another question, which is like education says, will financial inclusion says help the government address financial inclusion since banks are not being able to profitably serve rural India currently?
Okay. It's very good question. It's sort of the economics of this whole thing. Uh,
Right.
the infrastructure that we are trying to build costs money. Who should pay for it? Should the government put a cess? And I know you have given it a lot of thought. So give
Right.
us some
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I guess the philosophy I've always had is if you leave it to entrepreneurs, in a sense, sometimes to solve a problem, they could probably do it cheaper and better if they had certain incentives appropriately placed. If the government chose to do it, sometimes the cess. First, you have to raise the cess, then you have to deploy it efficiently, and I think may not be the best way for the government to spend either their time or resources.
Mhm.
So if the market can solve the problem without, of course, complicating life and causing, say, monopoly issues, it's best left to private sector. And that's exactly what we were speaking about, that there is the ability to have this last mile fintech model, digital model sometimes, which can make things happen. But, and there's always a but, I think that but is, how do you give the right incentive to the market? And to my way of thinking, as long as the sum total of all the incentives that you give for encouraging financial inclusion, as long as that sum total is actually cheaper than the cost of government putting up a separate infrastructure, I think that's absolutely the right way to go.
Yeah,
And I often feel like, we deter on taking some of those decisions, which would be much cheaper and much more effective and empowering for everyone. So I'm actually a strong votary of, if the market can solve it, let them solve it.
right, right. And in fact, if you just look at the economics, the cost of providing a service through a teller or a branch or even an ATM
Right,
multifold compared to the in Kirana store solution and other
absolutely.
solutions. So
Right,
there is many of you have already taken the economics class. There is a Pareto improvement. We can make everyone better off without making anyone worse off. So uh, Shilpa and I, we are working together on some of these issues in trying to convince different players to see who should pay the infrastructure costs, like building the roads, and
hmm,
how much should it be raised through putting a tax either on banks or, but I think Shilpa is saying cess is not such a great idea.
yeah.
Okay, let me see if there are other questions.
Yeah, so the next one we have is are returns generated from impact investments on par with regular VC investments? Is this a key challenge when it comes to raising large scale impact funds?
Okay,
Yeah.
he's asking a very deep research question.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
if impact investing is not only creating impact, it's also creating returns, then you have the Lake Wobegon effect.
Right.
Everybody is beautiful and strong and above average. Is that
Right.
going on with impact investing?
Right. So our experience has actually been very positive, Bhagwan. So I would say that the way we look at impact investments for profit is we kind of, bucket them into two, three categories. So there are those who we feel, and let me take two illustrations, okay? If you take the education space, clearly if you disrupt that market, it was, in a sense, ripe for disruption. And if you can come out with something which offers cheaper, but actually better quality, education online, you could actually have a fantastic, business model out of that, and you could get equal to commercial returns even on your social impact investments. But there are business models which sometimes are more nascent, and the ones, for example, let's say to do with civic tech. civic tech is a good example. So if you had, let's say, an entrepreneur who said, look, I have this great geospatial solution. You can, take a picture of your property, give it to BMC and pay your property taxes off it. It's a great idea. It makes sense for everyone. But given, the structure of the market and the nascency of the product, you're not going to get a supernormal return over there. So
Yeah.
I'll say, we fund both types. We fund some where the return is equal to, if not better, and some which are in less mature industries, which are a little bit more, we'll be happy if we get our money back and a modest return over that.
Yeah. So I think what you're saying is the right way to think about it. Impact investing isn't just one bucket. There
That's
are
true.
some that will happen on its own if we make sure that all the pieces are in the right places. And that's one thing Omidyar
Right.
and other people do. In the second one, it may need a little help because they don't have the scale yet. That may be one reason. Or it will become profitable once it sees the light of day. So they are willing to take a cut in some sense right now to make sure that it happens. And the third category, of course, is that it is pure social good. You know,
That's
we have to do it too.
true.
And so media is involved in all three in some sense.
Correct. Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
Um, Other questions. We are coming almost to the end. Is that right, Sulagna?
Yes, Professor, we have around 10 minutes left.
We have 10 minutes left. So if there are another question, I'll take it. Otherwise, I'll proceed with more questions.
So maybe one last question, which is for both of you. So Sagar wants to know that about both of your views on what is stopping impact bonds to pick up in India.
Mhm. Right.
Okay. You want to go first?
Okay. So let me give my perspective. For impact bonds, there's a lot to do with actually measuring impact that needs to be achieved. And I think the short answer to this is if the costs of measuring the impact outstrip the benefit that can come, then it doesn't become very worthwhile. So that's like a short answer, but would love to hear your views, Bhagwan.
Yeah, so I think about impact bonds and impact related securities, and I've done some work on that. The two issues that one of the issues that Shilpa mentioned is metrics. We need to create metrics that are reliable, non-manipulable.
Right.
Very important, right? Because you're going to make your contracts depend on those metrics. So you need to make sure that those cannot be manipulated in some sense.
Mhm.
And they use data that everybody agrees on. And this is another infrastructure issue. I think over time, institutions are going to develop those metrics because we haven't spent enough resources on them. Right now, it's hard to do it, but as we become better at doing these metrics, I think we will see more of it. The second thing I want to say is whenever you combine finance with metrics, it's like Diwali just passed by. It's like having a dynamite in one hand and a match in the other hand. If you don't do it right, because finance can explode, a little error here and there can make a big difference. So imagine that you were saying impact should be based on something that is being measured. But the person who's measuring is corruptible or some other such thing. That kills the whole thing. So I think we have to tread that very carefully in making sure those metrics that we are creating are sound. Uh,
Yeah. Very well said. Yeah. Thank you.
um, Sulakna?
Question Aslam, 5 minutes.
Yeah, Professor, no more questions for now.
Okay, so I am going to sort of wrap it up with a little bit more personal advice from you. So one thing I have to say is, I don't know if you guys know this. So I'm going to say some complimentary things about you, Shilpa.
Mhm. Okay.
This is not finance, but I don't know if you noticed how patiently she answered questions, in measured tones, not, this is something to learn for women, especially if you're going to be in board meetings and stuff. Uh, this goes a long way. The second thing you might have noticed was how often she said Bhagwan. It was not because she was trying to collect punya, although she did collect a lot of punya by saying Bhagwan. I think in conversations, when you use the other person's name, there is more intimacy and informality that is created. And I think it's a great skill. I noticed it. I don't do it as much. I didn't say Shilpa, Shilpa, and when you said Bhagwan. But I
Okay.
want my students to notice that that's actually a great, great trait to have to create that bond with the person you are talking to. But I want to end by you giving some advice to our
Mm-hmm.
students. One is to our students who are young,
Mm-hmm.
and they always have this idealism in them. I want to make a difference, but they also have loans to pay back.
Mm-hmm. Right.
How do you tread that? How do you go that line? And the second advice I want you is especially for our women.
Mm-hmm.
How should they step into the world now that you have spent last 2 or 3 decades in it? What advice do you have for our women? So we'll
Right.
close with those two.
Yeah. No, no, great questions to end with. And I think the first thing I'd say is if there ever was a time, for a person to follow their passion and still make a living, I think that time is now. And I'm just blown away by some of the people I'm meeting at Omidyar, some of the people who approach us, both to fund, their dreams in terms of for-profit startups or to fund their dreams in terms of actually just doing civil society work. I think I'm blown away by both sides of it. So let me just share very briefly that we actually
సార్ పూజ
fund.
చేస్తున్నట్రా ఇప్పుడు
Uh,
సంధ్యానికి పూజ చేస్తున్నారు
sorry,
Somebody's
చేస్తున్నాం
you're hearing,
yeah,
somebody needs to mute.
yeah.
నేను ఆ
So
గిన్నెలు తీసి పెడుతున్నా ఇది అయిపోగానే
I don't know who is unmuted. Can you mute everyone except Shilpa, please?
yeah, okay. I think we have that. So the point I was making is even in terms of social enterprise, I think the opportunities for people to make their mark have just gone up tremendously. And we're working with incubators like Encore who help young people do that in fabulous ways. So I think that's really, my first advice, just follow your dreams and there's various opportunities to make them happen.
And
Uh,
work hard. Follow your dreams and work hard, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that goes, I'm assuming that, since it's your dream, you're going to work hard anyway.
Okay.
Yeah. I think for, women, I would say that, don't let anything hold you back. I think be honest to your ambition. Ambition often does get mixed up with a lot of factors, both social and otherwise, which might want to deter you from doing what you'd like to do. I think again uh, do not be held back by any of that thinking. I think, but when you go out, also be thoughtful, be prepared, to take advantages of the opportunities that come your way. And frankly, let me end by saying when I joined ICICI, Bhagwan, I never thought that I would, in a sense, leave from the top office in that building when I did. So I think with hard work and, persistence and passion, I think things do happen. Right. Thank you.
So thank you, Shilpa. This was very, very thoughtful, very enlightening. And thank you all for listening. We are going to post this video online for those who could not join us. So Shilpa, I have to say that we have to bring you to campus. Our goal was to bring you to campus because of the situation we could not. But I think all our ISB students would love to meet you in flesh and blood and just hang out with you and be inspired. So
I'd love to do that. And thank you so much for today, to you and to the team at ISB. Thank you.
thank you everyone for putting it together. Bye.